The maid in her dream, Amara Johnson, had learned to live in the shadows of other people's lives. At 28 years old, she carried not only the weight of her unborn child, but also the heaviness of dreams she once believed could carry her, across stages, spotlights, and recording studios. Long before she became the quiet maid sweeping marble floors and polishing silverware in the sprawling Caldwell mansion, she had been the girl who sang in her church choir, who scribbled lyrics on scrap paper while riding the bus, who saved every dollar to pay for open mic nights in the small clubs of Nashville. Her voice had once been described as honey poured over fire, smooth, warm, but burning with something fierce beneath the sweetness. It was that same fire that made people pause when she sang, that made strangers lean closer, that made her mother squeeze her hand after church and whisper, "Your voice is your way out, Amara. Don't let anyone bury it." But life had buried it anyway. When she discovered she was pregnant, the man she loved, Jake, a fellow musician with promises as wide as the Tennessee sky, vanished before the first ultrasound. He had whispered about forever, about recording duets, about taking her with him on the road. But when responsibility tapped on the door, Jake ran as if chased by wolves. The disappointment nearly broke her, but Amara refused to collapse. Found work as a maid, first in hotels, then in private estates, telling herself it was temporary. Just until the baby came. Just until she found the courage to chase her dream again. Yet days turned into months, and the dream felt like something from another lifetime, too fragile to carry in the same hands that now carried buckets, rags, and heavy vacuum cleaners. The Caldwell mansion was another world compared to her small apartment with peeling paint and a sagging couch. It sat on a hill in Brentwood, a palace of glass and stone where fountains danced in the courtyard and imported roses lined the driveway. Inside, chandeliers glittered like frozen fireworks. Polished staircases curled upward toward suites the size of Amara's entire apartment building. The owner, Daniel Caldwell, was a millionaire in the software security industry, known for his calm intelligence and philanthropic projects. But most people spoke more often about his wife, Vanessa, whose beauty was matched only by her reputation for cruelty. Vanessa was the kind of woman who treated staff like decorations there to be moved, used, and ignored. Her words were sharp, her smiles thin, her presence demanding. Daniel's quiet warmth seemed out of place beside her constant need for control. Yet Amara told herself it wasn't her place to wonder why. She was there to clean, not to question. Still, she could not help noticing the small differences between the two. When Daniel passed her in the hallway, he would nod politely sometimes, even pause to ask if she was managing with her heavy workload. When her back ached, he had once told her to take a break, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. Vanessa, on the other hand, spoke to Amara as though she were invisible until something went wrong. "This mirror is streaked," she snapped. "One morning, do it again, or stay out of my sight today. We have guests, and no one wants to see the help wandering about." On those days, Amara reminded herself of the reason she stayed, the paycheck that kept her tiny apartment, the crib she was saving for, the food she bought in careful portions to make every dollar stretch. She had no family left but the child, growing inside her, and she was determined that her baby would never know the kind of hunger she had known as a girl. Yet even in the monotony of dusting antiques and scrubbing marble counters, music found ways to escape her lips. Sometimes, while she worked in the study, she would hum softly, her voice barely rising above the whir of the vacuum. The songs were pieces of her past unfinished melodies she had once written about love, about pain, about the strength to stand again after falling. It was during one of these unguarded moments that Daniel paused in the doorway, listening. Startled when she saw him, immediately apologizing, but he simply shook his head. "Don't apologize," he said, his voice gentle. "It's beautiful, don't bury it." The word struck her deeper than he could have known. For hours afterward, as she scrubbed and polished, Amara carried them like a fragile flame. It had been so long since anyone reminded her that she had more to offer the world than labor and obedience. She pressed her hand over her belly, whispering silently to her baby, "Maybe one day you'll hear me sing for real." But Vanessa had overheard too. That evening, as Amara pushed her cleaning cart down the hall. She heard Vanessa's sharp voice through the cracked doorway of the bridal suite. "Leave the singer to me," Vanessa said into her phone. "I have the perfect solution. It will kill several birds at once." A pause. Then a laugh that chilled Amara's spine. "Yes, I know exactly who to use." Mara froze, her knuckles tightening around the cart handle. The words sank into her like cold rain, though she didn't fully understand their meaning. Still, she felt a tremor of unease ripple through her chest. She lowered her gaze and kept moving, reminding herself of her rule: keep your head down, do the work, and survive. Yet some part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa's eyes had been on her too often. Her smiles too sharp, her tone too sweet when it came to mentioning Amara's voice. In the kitchen, Tony Diaz, the head chef, noticed her pale face. Tony was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with laugh lines around his eyes and a habit of slipping her extra plates of food when he thought no one was watching. "Nina," he urged, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. "You're feeding too. Don't let that woman starve you with her nonsense." Mara smiled faintly, grateful for his kindness, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. She thought about the crib she had seen at the thrift store, painted white with little carved stars along the headboard. She almost had enough saved. If she worked overtime cleaning up after the upcoming wedding renewal ceremony, she could finally afford it. That thought gave her strength, but strength alone could not shield her from what Vanessa was planning. The renewal ceremony was set to be the grandest event Brentwood had seen that season. 300 guests, a ballroom glittering with crystal, a live band flown in from New York, and a custom song written just for the couple's first dance. The pressure was immense, and Vanessa thrived on it, snapping orders at the planner, the decorators, the caterers. Amara worked silently in the background, setting tables, arranging linens, polishing the silver trays that would carry caviar and champagne. She told herself it was just another job, just another day. But beneath her calm exterior, something stirred a feeling that her life was standing at the edge of a storm. And it came when Maggie Caldwell, Daniel's elegant mother, leaned over one afternoon and said softly, "I recall hearing someone in the house sing beautifully." "Was that you, dear?" Amara's cheeks burned. She shook her head quickly, mumbling something about just humming to pass the time. Maggie only smiled knowingly, her eyes kind. "Don't hide gifts like that. Duh. World needs more beauty." From across the room, Vanessa's gaze locked on the exchange, her nails digging into her palm. She had found her perfect pawn. That night, as Amara lay in bed, listening to the rain tap against her window, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, "No matter what happens, little one, we'll find a way to rise." She had no idea how true those words would soon become. For while she tried to imagine a quiet life of steady paychecks and small dreams, fate was preparing to thrust her voice, her pain, and her courage into the center of a ballroom filled with strangers, and nothing would ever be the same again. The setup, the days leading up to the Caldwell renewal ceremony, unfolded like a whirlwind, each one pulling Amara deeper into a storm she did not yet fully recognize. From the moment she entered the mansion each morning, the house felt like a hive of controlled chaos. Florists carried in buckets of white roses, their scent so thick it clung to Amara's uniform long after she passed the arrangements. Event planners shouted orders over the buzz of power drills as workers built a temporary stage in the ballroom. Crates of wine imported from Italy lined the kitchen, and delivery trucks backed into the driveway at all hours, unloading towers of champagne flutes, strings of twinkling lights, and velvet ropes that would mark off sections of the grand event. Every corner of the mansion seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were bracing for spectacle. For Vanessa, this was not simply a vow renewal ceremony. It was a performance, a chance to remind everyone in her glittering social circle that she was queen of this kingdom. She moved through the preparations like a conductor, snapping her fingers at decorators, raising her voice at planners, and ensuring every detail bent to her will. The roses must be ivory, not cream. Ivory, do you understand? If I see cream, I will fire the florist on the spot. Or, no, The chandelier light must fall exactly here, do you want the photographs to make me look pale? Her voice sliced through the air, leaving staff scrambling to meet her impossible demands. Amara, as always, kept her head down and her hands busy. She ironed linens until the creases looked sharp enough to cut glass. She polished trays until her reflection stared back at her like a ghost. She worked longer hours than ever before, her back aching from carrying boxes and bending over tables, but she did not complain. Each extra dollar she earned pushed her closer to the crib she wanted. For her baby, each minute of exhaustion felt like an investment in a better tomorrow. Yet beneath her calm obedience, Mara could not shake the feeling that Vanessa's eyes followed her more often than usual. Whenever she passed through the ballroom humming, softly to herself, a habit she had never quite managed to break, she felt the prickle of Vanessa's gaze. One afternoon, she overheard Vanessa murmuring sharply to the wedding planner, Julie Torres. "Don't worry about the singer, Vanessa," said. "I've already found someone suitable." Julie had frowned, shaking her head. "I don't think that's a good idea, Vanessa." But Vanessa's smile was cold and unwavering. "It's perfect. You'll see." Later that evening in the kitchen, Tony slid her a plate of roasted chicken and potatoes, lowering his voice. "The bridesmaids are gossiping," he told her. "They keep mentioning a surprise planned for the reception, and they keep looking at you when they talk." His expression darkened. "Be careful, Nina. That woman has something sharp in her eyes these days." Amara felt a shiver of unease ripple through her. She pressed her hand protectively over her belly, whispering to herself, "It's just nerves. It's nothing more." But when she returned to the ballroom to stack chairs, she caught Vanessa standing in the doorway. Her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The night before the ceremony, the household reached a fever pitch. The mansion glowed like a lantern in the darkness as crews worked late into the evening, stringing lights along the balconies and testing the sound system in the ballroom. The band rehearsed the commissioned first dance song, their instruments filling the air with lilting notes, but disaster struck just as Amara carried a tray of glassware across the hall. She heard Julie's sharp intake of breath and turned in time to see the lead singer clutching his throat. Moments later, Julie was on the phone with a doctor, her face pale. "He has laryngitis," she whispered to Vanessa. "Doctor's orders, no singing for at least a week. He can't perform." For a brief moment, panic flickered in Vanessa's eyes. But then something darker replaced it: calculation, like the gears of a plan snapping into place. She laid her manicured hand on Julie's arm and said smoothly, "It's fine. I already have a solution." Her gaze flicked toward Amara, who froze mid-step, the glasses trembling on her tray. That night, Amara tried to ignore the sinking dread gnawing at her chest. In her small apartment, she sat on the sagging couch, her swollen feet propped on a cushion, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She called her old friend Sarah, a fellow singer from her Nashville days. Sarah listened quietly as Amara explained the strange events of the past few days, the way Vanessa had been watching her, the way people kept hinting at a surprise. Sarah's voice on the other end was heavy with concern. "Be careful, Amara. That setup sounds too convenient. If she's pushing you to sing, it might not be out of kindness. Don't let her use you." "I don't have a choice," Amara admitted, her voice trembling. "If I say no, I could lose my job. I can't afford that. Not now." She thought of the crib, the rent, the hospital bills that loomed closer with every passing month. "Then if you must do it," Sarah said gently, "sing your own truth. Don't let her script your humiliation. Remind them who you are." Amara wiped away tears, whispering, "I'll try." The morning of the ceremony arrived like a tidal wave. By dawn, the Brentwood Country Club buzzed with activity. White roses covered every surface, catering trucks lined the service entrance, and photographers tested their cameras against the glow of chandeliers. Waiters rushed back and forth, their arms full of crystal and china. Amara was assigned to the kitchen, folding napkins into intricate designs that seemed almost too delicate to touch. Tony pulled her into a chair and insisted she rest. "Be on your feet enough today," he said gruffly. But the reprieve was brief. By noon, Vanessa swept into the kitchen like a storm cloud, her gown glittering with sequins, her hair styled into perfect waves. She stopped in front of Amara, her smile as false as the diamonds on her neck. "Good morning, Amara," she said sweetly, though her eyes glinted with malice. "I hear you sing well. Our singer fell ill, and, well, we may need you. Just a simple ballad only as a backup plan. After all, Daniel has been so kind about your situation." Her gaze dropped pointedly to Amara's pregnant belly before rising again with a smirk. Amara's throat went dry. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her chest. Vanessa's tone carried no room for refusal. Slowly, hesitantly, Amara gave a small nod. The wheels of Vanessa's plan locked into motion, and Amara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet as the afternoon wore on, the mansion filled with guests. Luxury cars lined the driveway, spilling out men in tailored suits and women in gowns that shimmered like jewels. Laughter echoed through the halls, glasses clinked and music floated through the air. The ceremony itself was a spectacle of wealth. Vanessa, dazzling in her gown, Daniel distant but polite, Maggie watching with quiet grace. Amara worked silently behind the scenes, her nerves stretched taut as wire. She had not been called to the stage yet, but the anticipation gnawed at her. She could almost hear Sarah's voice in her ear. "Sing your own truth," by the time dinner was served. Amara's hands shook as she poured wine and cleared plates. The replacement singer performed. A few background pieces, his voice pleasant but unremarkable. Vanessa's dissatisfaction was visible in the tightness of her smile. She kept glancing toward Amara, her eyes glittering with expectation, as though she were savoring the moment before the trap snapped shut. At 8 o'clock, as the band prepared for the first dance, Vanessa suddenly seized Amara's hand. "Emergency," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "The singer doesn't know our song. You must save us, Amara. Just one ballad. My mother-in-law has already praised your voice." She pressed a folded sheet of paper into Amara's hand. Lyrics scribbled with impossible notes that seemed designed to break her. Amara's heart pounded. She wanted to refuse, to run, to scream that this was unfair. But 2 security guards blocked the exit, their faces impassive. Julie, the planner, gave her an apologetic look, her eyes full of guilt, as if to say she had tried to stop this but failed. Amara swallowed hard, clutching the crumpled paper. Her baby shifted inside her, a reminder of the life depending on her. Strength. She took a deep breath, whispering silently to herself, "This could break me, or save me." Then, with trembling hands, she stepped onto the stage. The voice that shook the room the moment Amara stepped onto the stage. The glittering ballroom seemed to swell around her, pressing down like a weight she could not escape. The chandeliers above burned brighter than the midday sun, casting a golden haze over the sea of 300 guests seated at tables draped in white and gold. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and she felt the force of their stares land heavy on her shoulders. She was not dressed for a performance. Her maid's uniform was simple. Black and shapeless, her apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. Her 6-month belly prominent beneath the fabric. Around her gown sparkled like gems. Tuxedos gleamed. In the light, and laughter faded into a hum of curiosity. For many, she was just a maid, an invisible part of the machinery that made evenings like this possible. Now, suddenly, she stood in the center of their stage, summoned like a prop in Vanessa's cruel theater. Vanessa herself was radiant as she lifted the microphone, her voice honeyed with false sweetness that barely concealed her malice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "tonight we have a surprise. My maid believes she can sing. Let's give her a chance to entertain us." Words cut like glass, deliberately chosen to reduce Amara to nothing more than a servant playing at artistry. A few guests chuckled softly, others exchanged curious glances. But the undertone was unmistakable. This was meant to be humiliation, not celebration. Amara's throat tightened, her hands trembling as she clutched the folded lyric sheet Vanessa had pressed into her palm. The notes scrawled on the page were ridiculous, leaping into impossible registers, written not to showcase talent, but to guarantee failure. She looked at the bandleader who rifled through his sheet music and frowned. "We don't have this," he muttered. "There's nothing prepared." The violinist shrugged helplessly. The pianist lifted his hands and let them fall. And the drummer tapped nervously on the edge of his kit. It was chaos disguised as order, a setup designed for her to collapse. For one terrifying heartbeat, Amara considered running. She imagined dropping the sheet, pushing past the guards, and escaping into the night. Away from the glitter, the ridicule, the sharp smiles that waited for her failure. But then her baby shifted inside her, a strong flutter against her ribs, as though reminding her that she was not only standing for herself tonight. She pressed her hand to her belly, drew a long breath, and lifted her chin. "Give me a slow 4/4," she said quietly to the drummer. Her voice trembling at first, but steadier as the words left her lips. "I'll sing my own song." Drummer hesitated, then tapped out a simple beat. The pianist caught on, laying a soft progression beneath the rhythm. The violinist leaned in, bow resting on strings, waiting. The band, professional enough to adapt in seconds, gave her the foundation she needed. Amara, standing in a uniform, meant to erase her, opened her mouth and poured herself into the room. The first line wavered, a thin thread of sound stretched across silence. "When dreams turn to dust, and the ones you trust leave you behind." Her voice cracked slightly on the second word, nerves pulling her down, but then something shifted. She closed her eyes, not seeing the ballroom, not seeing Vanessa's smirk, not seeing the chandeliers or the curious faces. Instead, she saw her mother's face, smiling from the church pews, mouthing the words, "Sing, baby girl. Don't hide it." She saw herself as a teenager, clutching a cheap microphone. At a Nashville open mic night, the small crowd clapping as though they were hearing something more than notes, they were hearing survival. And she saw the baby inside her, a future she refused to surrender, a reason to keep going. By the chorus, her voice bloomed. It rose strong and rich, threaded with grit, carrying the weight of every loss she had endured and every ounce of strength she had gathered. The song she sang was one she had written years ago, called "Rise from the Ashes." It was not polished, not recorded, not something meant for grand halls. But it was hers. "I'll rise from the ashes, though the fire takes it all. I'll climb from the ruins, though the world lets me fall. You can break me in pieces, you can laugh while I cry, but I'll rise, oh I'll rise, and I'll still touch the sky." Room grew utterly still. Waiters froze mid-step, trays suspended in their hands. Conversations died. Forks clinked against plates and then lay forgotten. The guests who had come expecting spectacle now leaned forward, drawn in by something raw and undeniable. Her voice was not the forced elegance of a trained professional, but it carried a truth that polished perfection could never mimic. It carried pain, resilience, and hope, an anthem of survival rising from the throat of a woman society had tried to bury. At the edge of the room, Daniel Caldwell stood rooted, his drink forgotten in his hand. He had seen Amara before, day after day, quiet and efficient, always moving with her head lowered. But now he saw something entirely different, a woman standing taller than the glittering towers of wealth surrounding her, her voice cutting through years of silence. His chest tightened as the song swelled, and for a moment, the noise of the ballroom vanished. It was only her voice, only the truth it carried, when the final note hung in the air. Trembling like a flame at the edge of wind, silence stretched for 3 long seconds. Amara's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands still pressed protectively to her belly, her eyes closed as though afraid to open them. Then the room erupted. Applause crashed like waves against the stage. Gasps mingled with cheers, and some guests even rose to their feet. The sound overwhelmed her, so loud it vibrated through her bones. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she fought them back, holding her head high. But Vanessa, furious, would not let her moment stand. She stormed onto the stage, her heels striking hard against the polished wood, snatched the microphone from Amara's hand. Her smile was stretched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. "Cute," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll get back to the kitchen where you belong." The words slammed into the room, cold and contemptuous. An attempt to shove Amara back into the shadows, The applause faltered, unease rippling through the crowd. Then, as Amara turned to step down, disaster struck. Spilled glass of champagne. Near the edge of the stage, caught her foot. Her body lurched, balance slipping, and she fell hard onto her hip, her hands instinctively clutching her belly. Pain flared sharp and hot through her side. Cut the music. Daniel's voice roared across the room as he leaped forward, shoving past stunned guests. Chairs toppled in his wake, glasses shattered on the floor, but he didn't stop until he reached her. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. "Amara, are you cramping? Are you bleeding?" His panic was unfiltered, his concern so raw that the entire room could see it. "Call the paramedics." Michael Reed, Daniel's business partner, shouted from across the hall. Already pulling his phone from his pocket, Tony sprinted toward the stage, grabbing towels and a glass of water, his face pale with fear. Maggie Caldwell rose slowly from her chair, her expression a mix of shock and fury, her gaze fixed on her daughter, Dash and Dash Law. Vanessa shrieked above the chaos. "What about my first dance?" The guests are waiting, but no one cared about her words. Anymore. The room had shifted, its attention locked on the woman who had been forced into the spotlight and now lay on the floor, cradling her unborn child. And in that instant, as the paramedics rushed through the doors, the truth of the night began to unravel, not the glittering image Vanessa had tried to craft, but the reality she had tried so hard to bury. The trap she had set was snapping shut, but not around Amara. It was closing on herself. Truth uncovered, the sirens arrived in less than 5 minutes, though, for Amara, lying on the stage with her breath coming in shallow bursts. It felt like an eternity stretched across the polished floor. Guests parted as paramedics rushed in. There. Navy uniforms cutting through the sea of gowns and tuxedos. One knelt beside her immediately, slipping a cuff around her arm to take her blood pressure, while another gently pressed on her abdomen. "6 months?" he asked quickly. Amara nodded, clutching her belly tighter, terrified of what they might find. The cool gel of an emergency Doppler pressed against her skin, and the faint but steady thump of her baby's heartbeat filled the tense silence. Relief washed over her like a tide, though the ache in her hip throbbed with every movement. Daniel remained by her side, one hand steadying her shoulder, the other brushing damp hair from her forehead. His tuxedo jacket was rumpled, his body askew, his face drawn with worry that stripped away all pretense of formality. He did not look like a millionaire host anymore. He looked like a man desperate to make sure the woman on the ground did not break. "I'm coming with her," he said firmly as the stretcher was wheeled in. Vanessa's shrill voice cut through the room. "Daniel, this is ridiculous. She's the help, not family. You're humiliating us in front of everyone." The words struck the crowd like a slap, drawing murmurs and sharp glances. Maggie Caldwell, elegant in her silver gown, rose from her chair and fixed her daughter-in-law with a glare that could cut steel. "Vanessa, enough." Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay a razor edge that silenced even the most persistent whispers as Amara was lifted carefully onto the stretcher. Her face pale and her breaths uneven, Tony slipped forward and pressed her hand. "You're strong, Nina," he whispered. "Don't let them take your dignity. We'll be right behind you." Michael Reed had already called for updates, speaking into his phone with rapid urgency as he coordinated with the hospital. Julie Torres, the wedding planner who had carried guilt in her eyes for days, stepped toward Vanessa, her hands trembling. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" she asked softly. But before Vanessa could retort, Tony pulled a small recording device from his pocket. He held it up high, his thumb pressing play. The ballroom filled with Vanessa's own voice, sharp and cold. "Don't let the pregnant maid off stage. Let her humiliate herself so she knows her place. Ethan will never know I set this up." I think she failed on her own. Gasps rippled across the room. Some guests clutched their pearls, others shook their heads in disbelief. Maggie's face drained of color, but her eyes burned with fury as she turned fully toward Vanessa. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Vanessa stammered, poise unraveling under the weight of exposed truth. That's been edited. It's not real. He's lying. But the conviction in her voice faltered, drowned by the evidence echoing from Tony's recording. Julie looked sick, Confirming with a slow shake of her head that she had indeed heard similar words whispered in confidence days before, Daniel stood frozen for only a heartbeat, then straightened, his expression hardening into something no one had ever seen from him before, reached for his left hand, twisted the wedding ring he had worn for years, and slid it free. The metallic sound as it dropped onto the table nearby rang louder than the chandeliers above. "Hey, this mistake ends now," he said, his voice clear enough for every guest to hear. "It ends tonight." Vanessa lunged forward, her face flushed red. But Daniel turned his back to her without hesitation, stepping into the paramedic's path. "I'm going with her," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. When Vanessa shrieked, You can't just walk out on me in front of everyone." Daniel glanced over his shoulder, his eyes cold as steel. "You're right. I can't. Which is why the papers you thought we filed were never signed. There was never a marriage to begin with. And there never will be." The room erupted into murmurs again, the scandal rippling through the wealthy crowd like fire on dry grass. Maggie, though visibly shaken, gave a small nod of approval, her lips pressed tightly together. Michael followed Daniel quickly, already issuing orders to security to escort Vanessa out of the ballroom. Julie, tears spilling down her cheeks, whispered to no one in particular, it should never have come to this. The stretcher rolled toward the exit, Daniel walking beside it, his hand never leaving Amara's. She was too dazed to comprehend fully what had just happened. But the sight of Vanessa's face contorted with fury as security closed in gave her a strange, quiet strength. For the first time in years, Amara felt that her truth was no longer hidden in shadows at Cedars-Sinai. The emergency room bustled with late-night urgency, but Amara was rushed immediately into an examination. Dr. Karen Williams, a seasoned obstetrician with kind eyes, quickly performed an ultrasound. The rhythmic sound of the baby's heartbeat once again filled the room, steady and strong. "The baby is fine," Dr. Williams said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You've got some bruising on the hip and stress-induced contractions, but nothing dangerous. We'll keep you under observation for the night." Relief flooded Amara's body, tears finally slipping from the corners of her eyes. Daniel, who had not left her side, let out a long breath as though he had been holding it for hours. He sat beside her bed, his tuxedo shirt wrinkled and his tie loose. His eyes locked on her face as though the rest of the world had vanished. "You saved me tonight," he said quietly. Amara blinked at him, confused. "I ruined your celebration. Your entire night was destroyed because of me." Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, you revealed the truth. You freed me from a trap I didn't even realize I was in. And you reminded me that honesty and courage matter more than appearances. That's worth more than any ceremony." Back at the country club, Michael and Maggie managed the aftermath. Security had escorted Vanessa to a private room where her parents, mortified by her behavior, confronted her with disappointment sharper than any rebuke. Guests whispered and gossiped, but many left quietly, shaken by what they had witnessed. The night that was supposed to crown Vanessa queen of her social circle had collapsed into scandal, leaving her reputation in tatters. Meanwhile, Tony ensured the staff were looked after, reminding them that Vanessa no longer had power over their livelihoods, as the night stretched into early morning. Amara lay in the hospital bed, her hands still resting protectively over her belly. Daniel remained nearby, his phone buzzing with messages he ignored. Maggie arrived just after dawn, her expression softened with genuine concern. She sat gently at the edge of Amara's bed and reached for her hand. "You have more courage than most people in that ballroom combined," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Amara could barely find her voice, but she whispered, "I only wanted to survive. I didn't mean to cause all this." Maggie squeezed her hand. "Sometimes survival itself is the loudest truth. And tonight, the world heard yours." As sunlight crept into the hospital room, casting a warm glow across the walls, Amara closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her down. Yet even in her fatigue, she knew something fundamental had shifted. The life she thought she was confined to, a life of quiet labor, invisibility, and endurance, had cracked open. She had stood on a stage meant to humiliate her, and instead claimed it as her own. She had been pushed into the fire, but she had risen from it, and though Vanessa's voice still echoed faintly in her ears. Sharp and cruel. Amara clung to a louder sound, the roar of applause. The steady heartbeat of her child, and Daniel's quiet words that promised the future might yet hold something she had thought forever lost: freedom, dignity, and perhaps even the chance to dream again. A new beginning. The weeks following the disastrous renewal ceremony felt like walking out of a storm into an unfamiliar calm. The night had ended in flashing ambulance lights and whispered scandals, but the echoes carried on far beyond that ballroom. Vanessa Caldwell's reputation crumbled almost overnight. The recording Tony had captured spread quickly among Brentwood's elite, passed from guest to guest like wildfire. Stories leaked to society columns, reporters sniffed around the country. Club, and though Daniel refused to fuel the gossip, the truth could not be contained. The woman who once held court over every social gathering now found herself unwelcome. Her name spoken with a mix of pity and disdain. Her parents whisked her away to a villa in Florida, far from the circles that had once bowed at her presence. And in her absence, the mansion felt different, lighter, freer. Almost as if the very walls exhaled relief. For Amara, days blurred together with hospital checkups, gentle walks, and long hours of quiet recovery. Dr. Williams insisted she avoid strenuous work, and for the first time in years, Amara obeyed without guilt. Daniel insisted on covering her medical bills, despite her protests. And though accepting help was difficult for someone who had built her life on survival alone, she could not deny the relief it brought. Each time she pressed her hand to her belly and felt her baby's steady kicks, she whispered a silent thank you that they had made it safely through that night. Daniel visited often, sometimes with Maggie, sometimes with Tony, sometimes alone. He no longer approached her as a distant employer, but as someone determined to understand her, to listen, to stand beside her without judgment. They talked about music, about the songs she had written in notebooks, now tucked away in a box beneath her bed, about the dreams she had once chased before life forced her down a harsher road. Daniel listened with an attentiveness that unsettled her at first, as though he saw her not as a maid or an employee, but as a woman who carried stories worth hearing. One afternoon, sitting on the veranda outside her apartment with the autumn sun warming their faces, Daniel asked gently, "Will you sing again?" Amara laughed softly, the sound tinged with disbelief. "Sing again? I barely survived the last time." She shook her head, staring out at the street where children played jump rope between parked cars. "I sang because I had no choice. That wasn't a performance. That was survival. Survival is often the most honest kind of art," Daniel said. His eyes lingered on her face, thoughtful, intent. "You moved people that night. Not because of the setting, but because you gave them truth. Do you know how rare that is?" Mara's throat tightened, her eyes burning as she remembered the roar of applause. The shock on faces that had once ignored her. They applauded. "Because they pitied me," she whispered. "No," Daniel countered firmly. "They applauded because they recognized strength. They saw something real, something they couldn't fake in their designer clothes and polished smiles. You gave them a piece of your soul, and they knew it." She said nothing for a long while, but that night, after Daniel left, she pulled out one of her old notebooks. The pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, the lyrics scribbled across them raw and uneven. She read the words of a younger version of herself, the girl who had believed in music as a way out, and for the first time in years, she felt that belief stir again. Meanwhile, Daniel's life shifted in ways he had not expected. The unraveling of his marriage, or rather, the revelation that no true marriage had ever existed, freed him from the suffocating performance he had lived under. For years he had told himself that appearances mattered more than discomfort, that keeping peace was easier than facing truth. But standing in that ballroom, watching Amara sing, he had realized how much of himself he had buried to maintain an image. It was Amara's voice, unpolished yet unbreakable, that cut through his illusions. He filed papers officially severing any ties to Vanessa, refused to entertain her desperate calls, and redirected his energy toward something he had long neglected. Authenticity. Maggie watched quietly from the sidelines, her approval evident in the small ways she supported them both. She visited Amara often, bringing soups and fresh flowers, and she spoke candidly to her son about the dangers of slipping back into old patterns. "Do not let the world trap you again in appearances," she told Daniel one evening. "Truth matters more than glitter. You saw that on stage? Don't forget it." The first time Amara sang again in public was not in a ballroom, but in the modest sanctuary of her neighborhood church. Sarah, her old friend, had encouraged her to join a Sunday service, promising there would be no judgment, only community. At first, Amara refused, her nerves still raw from the trauma of the wedding night. But eventually she agreed, and when the choir director asked if she would lead a hymn, she could not bring herself to say no. Standing before the congregation, the wooden pews filled with familiar faces, she lifted her voice once more. This time there were no chandeliers, no gowns, no cruel eyes waiting for her to stumble. There was only music, rising like prayer, and the tears of those who listened. When she finished, the applause was not thunderous but warm, a circle of hands, clapping with love instead of spectacle. It healed something inside her. From that day forward, she began to practice again. Slowly, at first singing while she cooked, humming as she walked, reading her old lyrics aloud as though reacquainting herself with a long-lost friend. Daniel, true to his word, supported her without pushing, connected her with a small recording studio run by a friend, where she could lay down tracks at her own pace. The first time she stepped into the booth, headphones pressing against her ears, she felt her knees tremble. But when the music began, when her voice filled the empty space, she realized she was no longer the maid trying to disappear in the background. She was Amara Johnson, a woman with a story to tell. Months passed, and her pregnancy advanced, her belly round and firm, her steps slower but steadier. Each appointment brought reassurance that her baby was strong, healthy, ready to enter the world. With every kick and flutter, Amara felt renewed determination to create a future worth handing to her child. The music she recorded was not polished, pop, or radio gloss. It was raw, soulful, threaded with grit. The studio engineer told her, "People are going to feel this. This is real." For the first time, she believed him. The moment that sealed, her transformation came at a charity gala organized by Maggie Caldwell. Unlike the lavish spectacle Vanessa would have orchestrated, Maggie's event was understated, focused on raising funds for community schools. She invited Amara to perform, not as a maid, not as a novelty, but as an artist. Amara hesitated until the very last moment, standing backstage with her hands trembling against the microphone. Then she remembered her mother's words. "Your voice is your gift. Don't let anyone bury it." When she stepped onto the stage that night, the audience saw not a servant dragged into the spotlight, but a woman who belonged there. She sang with every fiber of her being, her voice soaring above the hushed crowd, carrying the same truth that had once silenced a ballroom, but this time she chose it. She owned it. When she finished, the standing ovation was not born of scandal or surprise, it was born of respect. In the front row, Daniel stood clapping, pride clear on his face. Maggie's eyes shone with tears. Tony cheered louder than anyone, and Amara, holding the microphone close, whispered into the air, "This is for you, little one." Weeks later, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. As she held her daughter for the first time, tiny fingers curling around hers, she whispered, "We rose from the ashes, didn't we? And now we'll keep rising." Her journey had not erased the hardships, the pain, or the cruelty she endured, but it transformed them. She was no longer only a maid, no longer only a survivor. She was a mother, an artist, a woman who had been tested in fire and had come out stronger. And though the world would always try to define her, she knew the only definition that mattered was the one she gave herself. From that day forward, whenever she sang, her daughter nestled against her chest. Amara remembered the night Vanessa tried to silence her. She smiled, because in trying to destroy her, Vanessa had unwittingly set her free.